Ezekiel Thornfield had spent years building his reputation as a man of faith, a shepherd guiding his flock with unwavering authority. Celestina Graves had spent just as long tearing down the corrupt, delivering justice with a cold, ruthless precision. They were an unlikely pair, the pastor and the judge, a man of God and a woman of law. But on their wedding night, beneath the glow of candlelight and the weight of whispered vows, one of them would not make it to the morning. Pastor Ezekiel Thornfield stood at the pulpit, his voice rich and commanding as he preached to his devoted congregation. The church was his domain, a place where his word was law, where people hung on his every syllable, desperate for guidance. He had built this following from the ground up, transforming a modest chapel into a thriving ministry. People saw him as a man of God, a leader, a moral compass. He saw himself as something greater, a man destined for influence beyond the church. Walls, Celestina Graves, on the other hand, thrived in a different kind of authority. She had carved out a reputation as a formidable judge, feared in the courtroom for her unshakable demeanor and unrelenting pursuit of justice. She had spent years earning the respect of her peers, fighting for her position in a world where she was constantly underestimated. The law was her church, and she was its high priestess, dispensing justice with a firm and steady hand. Their paths crossed in a way that no one could have predicted. Celestina was not the type to indulge in religion. She believed in facts, logic, and the power of human will over divine intervention. But curiosity, or perhaps a deeper unspoken need, led her to one of Ezekiel's sermons. She watched him command the room with effortless authority, moving through his message like a practiced storyteller, weaving morality and scripture into something intoxicating. He was powerful, and power had always fascinated her. Ezekiel noticed her almost immediately. She didn't blend in with the rest of the congregation. Where others bowed their heads in reverence, she kept hers high. Where others nodded and whispered, "Amen," she remained silent, studying him with eyes that seemed to strip away every layer of pretense. He was intrigued. After the service, he made sure to approach her, offering his warmest pastoral smile. Though he could tell she wasn't easily charmed. Their conversations became longer, their meetings more frequent. Ezekiel found her intellect exhilarating. She challenged him in ways no one ever had. Celestina, in turn, found something appealing in his confidence, in his ability to sway people with nothing more than his voice. He made her feel seen in a way she hadn't expected. Despite their differences, a romance blossomed, defying logic and expectation. It was the kind of pairing that stirred whispers, the pastor and the judge, a union of faith and justice. The wedding was nothing short of grand. Celestina spared no expense, ensuring that everything was perfect, down to the last flower arrangement. Ezekiel played the role of the devoted groom, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands, blessing their union in front of hundreds of witnesses. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. As the ceremony unfolded, he noticed the way Celestina took charge, instructing the planners, correcting the placement of decorations, ensuring every detail was as she wanted it. It wasn't just her wedding, it was her production. It gnawed at him, this subtle reminder that she was in control. He was the pastor, yet she commanded the moment. When they exchanged vows, Celestina's words were crisp, clear, spoken with a confidence that sent a shiver down his spine. There was no trembling, no hesitation. She was the same woman she had always been, powerful, precise, unwavering. As they sealed their marriage with a kiss, the guests erupted in applause, oblivious to the storm beginning to brew beneath Ezekiel's polished exterior. He smiled, holding her close, whispering words of love in her ear. But in his mind, a new thought had taken root. She was strong, too strong. And for the first time, Ezekiel wondered if he had made a mistake. The honeymoon suite was bathed in warm golden light, the soft flicker of candles casting dancing shadows along the walls. Everything about the room was designed for romance. The satin sheets, the chilled champagne waiting in a silver bucket, the delicate floral arrangement strategically placed for aesthetic perfection. Ezekiel had imagined this night 1,000 times. It was supposed to be the final piece of his carefully constructed life, the moment when Celestina would surrender fully to him as his wife, both in body and spirit. He watched her as she moved through the room, her white silk robe draping elegantly over her frame. Her confidence was undeniable, even now. There was no nervous hesitation, no shy glances, just the same assured presence she carried in the courtroom. She was beautiful, strikingly so, but something about her composure unsettled him. There was no vulnerability, no deference, nothing. That indicated she saw him as the leader in their union. Ezekiel told himself it didn't matter. Once they were alone, once they had crossed that final threshold, things would shift. The dynamic would balance itself out. He poured them each a glass of champagne, handing one to Celestina as she took a seat on the edge of the bed. She accepted it with a nod, sipping slowly, her eyes steady on his. Anticipation coursed through him as he moved closer. The weight of the evening, the grandeur of their wedding, the applause of their guests, it had all led to this. His fingers traced the edge of her robe, his mind already envisioning what came next. But then, without warning, something broke the moment. The scent hit him like a punch to the gut. It was strong, overpowering, an unfamiliar odor that sent an immediate wave of revulsion through him. His grip tightened on the champagne flute, his throat constricting as the smell filled his senses. It was all-consuming, invading every breath, turning his stomach in knots. He recoiled slightly, his body tensing, his mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be the fabric of her dress, or perhaps the lingering fragrance of the reception hall. Maybe the room itself carried a scent he hadn't noticed before. He tried to push past it, to ignore the nagging discomfort clawing at the edges of his mind. But as she shifted closer, the smell intensified. A deep, involuntary disgust settled in his gut. His mind twisted around it, searching for something, anything, to rationalize what he was experiencing. But he couldn't escape the primal reaction it triggered within him. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. His bride, the woman who had commanded the courtroom, who had stood before a crowd and declared herself his wife, was suddenly flawed. Not the perfect image he had envisioned, not the ethereal, untouchable figure he had built up in his mind. The thought sent a shiver through him. She reached for him, her touch warm against his skin, but he found himself pulling back before he could stop himself. His reaction was instant, instinctual. Disgust turned into something else, something darker, sharper. His heart pounded, his breath quickened. It wasn't just about the smell anymore. It was what it represented. This was a woman who had always been in control, who had carried herself with unshakable confidence. And yet, in this moment, she was vulnerable. She didn't even realize it. She thought she had won. She thought she had secured her future, her place beside him, her dominance within their marriage, but she was wrong. Something inside Ezekiel twisted, a slow, creeping realization settling in his bones. This wasn't about love. This wasn't about marriage. This was about power. And for the first time since they had exchanged vows, he knew he would not let her win. Ezekiel's breaths came sharp and shallow as his mind spiraled deeper into a haze of revulsion and fury. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, a suffocating force that threatened to consume him whole. Celestina was still unaware, still, moving toward him with the same assuredness she carried everywhere she went. She had no idea that everything had shifted, that the foundation of their marriage had already cracked beyond repair. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself, trying to push down the sickening churn in his stomach. but the smell lingered, wrapping around him like a thick, invisible fog. It was more than just the scent. It was the reality of it, the undeniable proof that she was not the woman he had envisioned. She was tainted, imperfect, unworthy. His disgust festered, twisting into something more volatile, more dangerous. His mind raced through the events of the past few months, every interaction, every moment where she had asserted herself, where she had made him feel lesser. The way she had planned the wedding without deferring to him. The way she had spoken her vows with unshaken confidence. The way she had taken control of every aspect of their lives together before they had even begun. She had walked into his world, into his faith, and instead of kneeling, she had stood taller. And now, here she was, believing she was his equal, believing she could own him. His gaze dropped to the silk pillow resting on the bed, its pristine surface unblemished, untouched. The thought came unbidden, a dark whisper slithering through his mind. It would be so easy. A single act. A moment of finality. He wouldn't have to feel this way anymore, this sickness, this humiliation. His hands moved before his thoughts could catch up. The pillow was in his grasp, its softness contradicting the storm raging inside him. He turned back to Celestina, who had begun to undress, unaware of the danger lurking mere feet away. She was vulnerable, defenseless. For the first time since he had met her, she was exposed. A twisted satisfaction surged through him. She had been so powerful, so untouchable in the courtroom, in society, in their marriage. But now, in this moment, she was nothing. He lunged forward, pressing the pillow over her face before she could react. She jerked beneath him, her body convulsing in shock. Her hands shot up, clawing at his arms, her nails sinking into his flesh, as she fought for breath. But Ezekiel didn't stop. He couldn't. This was his reckoning, his moment of control. The sounds she made were muffled, strangled gasps breaking against the thick fabric. Her legs thrashed beneath him, her body twisting and bucking as she fought with everything she had. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if she would overpower him, if she would somehow escape. But then, slowly, her resistance weakened. Her hands, once desperate and frantic, began to falter. His muscles burned from the effort, but he held firm, pressing harder, waiting for the inevitable stillness. The struggle beneath him became sluggish, her movements sluggish, fading into weak, sporadic jerks. Seconds stretched into eternity. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. Then, silence. A heavy stillness settled over the room. The candlelight flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The only sound was Ezekiel's own ragged breathing as he lifted the pillow away. Celestina's body lay motionless, her once commanding presence reduced to a lifeless shell. Her once bright eyes, so full of certainty and control, stared unseeing at the ceiling. A strange sense of calm washed over him. The weight that had pressed against his chest since the wedding lifted. He had taken back his power. He had reclaimed what had been stolen from him. But as the reality of what he had done sank in, a new thought took hold. What now? Ezekiel sat frozen beside Celestina's lifeless body, his breath coming in slow, uneven gasps. The room, once filled with warmth and promise, now felt suffocating, the air thick with something he couldn't name. He stared down at her, half expecting her to jolt awake, to sit up and fix him with that sharp, knowing gaze. But she didn't move. She never would again. The weight of what he had done pressed against his chest like a tightening noose. His fingers trembled as he wiped the sweat from his brow, his mind racing through every possible outcome. Panic threatened to overtake him, but he forced himself to remain still, to think. He couldn't afford to lose control now. Slowly, he stood and scanned the room. He had to act fast. The hotel staff would check on them in the morning, and the last thing he needed Was someone walking in before he was ready? His first instinct was to stage the scene, to make it look like an accident, something natural, something that would draw sympathy rather than suspicion. His eyes landed on Celestina's small travel bag near the dresser. He rummaged through it until he found a prescription bottle. Sleeping pills. He didn't know if she had actually taken any that night, but it didn't matter. He unscrewed the cap, pouring out a few onto the nightstand beside her motionless hand. Then, carefully, he tipped the bottle over, letting it roll just far enough to make it look like it had slipped from her grasp. An overdose. That was believable. That was tragic, not criminal. He adjusted the sheets, pulling them up just enough to make it seem as though she had peacefully drifted off to sleep. He smoothed the wrinkles, wiped away the moisture where her last breaths had warmed the fabric. Every detail had to be perfect. If anyone looked too closely, if they found any sign of struggle, the lie would unravel. He couldn't let that happen. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed his phone. He had to be careful. Too quick of a reaction, and it would seem rehearsed. Too delayed, and it would be suspicious. He waited, pacing the room, counting the seconds. 5 minutes. 10. Then, with the perfect amount of urgency, he dialed the hotel's front desk. "My wife. She's not waking up," he gasped, his voice laced with the right amount of panic. "Please, send someone. I don't know what's wrong." The response was immediate. Within minutes, footsteps thundered down the hall. Hotel staff rushed in, followed closely by paramedics. Ezekiel stepped back, his expression carefully crafted. Grief-stricken, confused, helpless. He watched as they checked her vitals, as they murmured among themselves. One of them turned to him, their face grim. "She's gone." Ezekiel collapsed, onto the chair beside the bed, burying his face in his hands. The weight of their gazes burned into him, but he remained composed. He had seen grief enough times in his church to know how to imitate it. Shock, disbelief, quiet, dignified sorrow. He played the part flawlessly. But just as relief began to creep in, his phone buzzed. A text notification lit up the screen. He almost ignored it, but something about the sender's name made his blood run cold. "Judge Graves, we've found something disturbing. Call me immediately." Ezekiel's pulse hammered in his ears. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the phone, scanning through the messages. They weren't meant for him. They were for Celestina. And as he read, his stomach twisted into a sickening knot. She had been investigating him, bank records, suspicious financial transfers, evidence of fraud within his ministry. Celestina had known. And worse, she had gathered enough proof to bring him down. She hadn't married him out of love. She had married him to destroy him. Ezekiel's breath hitched. His perfect crime was unraveling before it had even begun. Celestina had set a trap, and in his desperation, he had walked straight into it. Ezekiel's grip tightened around his phone as his pulse pounded in his ears. The words on the screen blurred, but their meaning was clear. Celestina had been investigating him. Their marriage had never been about love. It had been a setup, a carefully orchestrated plan to bring him down. And now she was dead. Panic clawed at his throat. He had thought he was in control, that he had taken back his power, but now he saw the truth. He had played right into her hands. Even in death, Celestina had outmaneuvered him. He forced himself to breathe, to steady the storm raging inside him. He couldn't afford to fall apart now. If Celestina had gathered evidence, someone else knew about it. The text message was proof of that. Whoever had sent it was expecting a response, and if they didn't get one, questions would be asked. He had to act. Now. Swiping to Celestina's messages, he studied the sender's number. Judge Graves. The name sent a fresh wave of dread through him. He didn't know if it was a colleague, a friend, or someone higher up in the legal system, but whoever it was, they were close enough to her to know about the investigation. And they were already suspicious. A plan formed in his mind. He typed a quick response, mimicking Celestina's style as best he could. "Not tonight. We'll talk tomorrow." It was simple, dismissive but not unusual, enough to buy him time. He hit send and watched as the message delivered. No immediate response. That was a good sign. Now he had to deal with the rest. The paramedics and hotel staff still hovered in the background, whispering among themselves, casting sideways glances at him. He needed to solidify his role, the grieving husband, blindsided by tragedy. Tears. He needed tears. He forced them out, burying his face in his hands as his shoulders shook. It wasn't difficult. The fear churning inside him made it easy. He let out a strangled sob, just enough to sound genuine, then looked up at the paramedics with red-rimmed eyes. "What happened?" he asked, his voice breaking. She was fine earlier. I don't understand." One of them placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It looks like an overdose," they said gently. "The sleeping pills." He nodded, letting out a shaky breath. She was stressed. The wedding? Work. I should have noticed something was wrong. The lie came effortlessly, slipping from his tongue like a well-rehearsed sermon, and they believed it. The rest of the night passed in a blur of flashing lights and quiet condolences. The hotel called the police, but there were no immediate signs of foul play. Just a tragic case of a newlywed bride passing away in her sleep. A perfect illusion. By morning, the news had spread. The headlines painted him as a heartbroken husband, a man who had found love only to lose it in the cruelest way. The church congregation sent messages of support, flooding his phone with prayers and sympathy. Everything was falling into place. But the relief was short-lived. A knock at his door sent a chill down his spine. When he opened it, a tall man in a dark suit stood before him, his expression unreadable. "Pastor Thornfield," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Judge Solomon Halloway. Celestina and I worked closely together. I need to ask you a few questions." Ezekiel's stomach twisted. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning.